I'm Howard Vogel. Today is July 25, 2016. I'm in Kingsport, Tennessee to interview legendary lawyer and my friend Bruce Shine. This interview is occurring as a part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Good morning, Bruce.
Good morning, Howard.
First, let me say it is a privilege and an honor to be here with you this morning for purposes of this interview. I have observed you throughout your legal career for so long as I have been at the bar, and you're one of my heroes, and I just want you to know that.
You're most kind.
Before we get started, and we have lots of things to talk about, perhaps those who are sharing this interview with us might be interested in your current state of health. I know you have been battling cancer since about 2009. Would you like to tell us a little about that?
Just briefly, I had mesothelioma. I thought we cured it. It appears that it may have returned to my right lung, and I've got two tumors on my head that won't heal, and I've got a tumor here in the side of my face. So for me, battling cancer is a constant thing, but has not interfered at all with my work or my practice of the law. And I'm very fortunate. I'm still around.
Well, I can say from personal observations, it never affected your ability to contribute to the ADR Commission, and certainly during the years that you served as its chair so admirably.
Thank you.
Let's get started.
Okay.
What is your full name?
My full name is David Bruce Shine.
Where were you born, Bruce, and when?
I was born on August the 11th, 1938. I believe it's the Lying In Hospital in Boston, thanks to my grandfather. My mother was in Mexico part of the time, and he insisted that I not be born in Mexico, and also was kind enough to make sure that my first name was not Jesus, which is what my mother had originally planned.
It sounds like your mother was an interesting person. What was her name, and tell us a little about her.
My mother was Alice Hedgenshine, who was really a woman unto herself. She always said she was, when she died, she was going to come back as a redhead and the dumbest woman in town and marry the wealthiest man. My mother was a writer, and she wrote and radio soap operas with Oliver Higgins Prouty, and did that 3 months of the year. At one point in her life with Frank Daly, a columnist, she and Frank had a column that they wrote out of Boston about Hollywood gossip and what was going on in Washington. And she and Frank Daly wrote two books, Grease, Gallant, and Glorious, and another one called America Goes to War, which my mother sold to a professor at the University of Michigan who was looking for tenure. And so he needed a book. So he somehow or another knew about my mother, and she sold him the rights to the book, but her name first and then his name came later.
You mentioned that your mother had spent some time in Mexico. Did she also spend time in Greece?
Yes, she did. When I was, she went to Greece at the beginning of World War, when Mussolini invaded Greece, left me in the United States, and worked on the opposition. Grease, Gallant, and Glorious, the book, was an unusual book in that it consisted a lot of cartoons and newspaper clippings put together. And the book didn't sell very well, and they needed something and my mother was quite a promoter too. She once was Sharky the Seal's press agent. But she they went to King Paul of Greece, who was in I forget where the hell he was. Maybe he was still in Athens. No, he wasn't. Probably in England. But anyway, and they said to him, you know, we'll like to donate half the profits of this book to Greek refugees. Would you be kind enough with Queen Frederica to do the introduction? And so King Paul did the introduction, and they doubled the price of the book. And with that, proceeded to sell a lot of books to a lot of Greeks who paid twice what they would have had they not bought it earlier.
Did you have a relationship with your mother's parents?
Not much, because they died, you know, and they're older, and I was not that close. My grandmother, both my grandparents had been Canadians who came down from Nova Scotia, even though part of our family had already come to New England and Virginia. The Chisholms on my grandmother's side and the Hudgens on my grandfather's side. And in fact, I still own property that our family has owned since 1803 in Cape Breton Island. And my grandmother, the one thing I remember most about my grandmother was that she would call onions onions, and had pictures of the Queen Mary and King George throughout her house. And so I've always been somewhat of a royalist.
Bruce, I think we have a little technical matter that needs to be addressed, so we're going to take a short break.
All right.
Bruce, do you have a sibling?
Yes, I have a sister, Linda Mary, and she is 5 years younger than I.
What does she do?
She is a retired lawyer. She's
younger.
Yes, she's 5 years younger. But she's had health problems for a long time. And she, like myself, went to Tusculum College and went to Drake University School of Law, was an assistant attorney general of the state of Missouri for a while, and with Social Security and other things. But her health has pretty much kept her retired for many years.
Did your little sister grow up in awe of her big brother?
You know, I doubt that. But I was away a lot at that point when you're 5 years difference, you know, with those formative years when you're 12 or 13, maybe be impressed with someone, and that person is already a freshman in college.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in what was then a small town in Virginia called Vienna, which is now a suburb of Washington. And then that was during the war. And then after the war, I went to Brookline, Massachusetts, and lived there. I lived in Brookline from the time I was probably about 5, 6, and until I went off to college.
When you were growing up there in Virginia and in Brookline, what were you interested in during those childhood years?
The same thing as everyone else, playing, having fun. You know, did I have any great special interests that I can think of now? No, I can't think of anything.
What became the things that you were interested in as a teenager?
Like most teenagers, I was interested in sports and you know, making that record so you can go on to college and you know, getting good grades. I played. I was a very poor hockey player, and so I became a goalie. And I played baseball, first base, and that was kind of it.
Have you maintained any longstanding relationships with childhood friends?
As a matter of fact, one who is, we didn't have contact with one another probably for 35 years, and emails. And I have not seen him since I was probably 23, 24. He lives in Massachusetts, and he has a wife has Alzheimer's, the beginning of it, and he's having a tough time. But it's amazing what email does. We stay in, he reads my column in the Kingsport newspaper every other week, sends me his observations, what's good, what's bad. And it's amazing. I mean, having not seen the man probably for 50 years.
Where did you attend elementary school?
I went to the Park School, Pierce School.
Do you have pleasant memories from that time?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
And how about middle school and high school?
I never went to a middle school. I went to Brookline High School. I liked it, and Brookline was a very amazing city, town of about 35, 40,000 people. Had a superb school system, nationally recognized, and same town that John Kennedy was raised in. So I lived there and through part of elementary and high school, and that was that.
Were you an avid reader during the pre-college days?
Oh yes, I was always an avid reader. My mother insisted upon that, and I can remember the Bobbs Merrill biography series of famous people. And I got involved. The only detective stories I ever read at that point in my life were, I don't know whether it was the author or the character, Ben Benson. He was a state trooper in the Massachusetts State Police. And he had these wonderful criminal investigations of murders and what have you that went on in Massachusetts. But no, I've always been an avid reader. And I find that life would be pretty damn sad if you didn't read.
You shared with us that you were the goalie on the hockey team and first baseman on the baseball team. Did you also participate in any school clubs during high school?
Oh yeah, I was president of the Student Forum, which was an organization that brought in prominent people to speak. I mean, congressmen, lieutenant governors, people like that. And I probably wrote for the newspaper, and, that's pretty much it.
Were the Kennedys known to you at that time while you were in high school? Was their political influence noticeable?
Well, I knew the Kennedys in a different way in that I was a page for Estes Kefauver off and on. While I was in high school. And I have two photographs of President Kennedy autographed in my office. One of them was shortly after he was elected to the United States Senate, and I was a page, and the ink is beginning to wear out, but it's the first photograph he used as a United States Senator. Then I have another photograph in there, which is that I was with Senator Kefauver, in between John Kennedy's election and his inaugural, and I went with Kefauver to Kennedy's house in Georgetown because Kefauver and Kennedy were going to talk about Paul Rand Dixon, who was a Tennessean, and who became chairman of the Federal Trade Commission. And he had been chief counsel of the Senate Antitrust and Monopoly Subcommittee, of which Senator Kefauver was chairman. And part of Kefauver worked very hard for Kennedy, and this was one of the kindnesses of the president. And I have the photograph that he gave me then, and a book, The Strategy of Peace, autographed by him.
Bruce, how did a young high school student from Brookline, Massachusetts connect with Senator Estes Kefauver?
Real simple. I was in the 8th grade, I guess, 7th or 8th grade. And I was told I had to write a letter to a candidate. It was in, let me see, it would have been in November, thereabouts, of 1951. And I had a social studies teacher that said I had to write a letter to a Republican candidate for president and a Democratic one. And I chose, and the Democratic one was Estes Kefauver because he was running against President Harry Truman. There was no one else. The Republican one was Harold Stassen, who I, from my research, was a man of great character and great ability. So I wrote, Stassen didn't pay much attention to me, and I wrote it on paper with my name and address printed on it that had been given to me the prior Christmas to write thank you notes to aunts and uncles who had given me presents. And because it was a letterhead, a formal letterhead, the Kefauver forces thought I must be an adult and maybe had some money. And I was invited to a cocktail party at the Boston Copley Plaza Hotel in January or early February 1952. And
so you were 14?
13.
13.
And my parents allowed me to go. And at that time, I met John Nixon. John Nixon, the federal judge in Nashville. And John Nixon was a student at Harvard Law School. And he was chairman of the Kefauver for President group at Harvard Law School. And I have a photograph somewhere of Kefauver, John Nixon, myself, and someone from Boston College and someone from, And Kefauver said to me, would you like to go to New Hampshire with me while I campaign? Well, there was very little Kefauver campaign. We had a station wagon, and that was where we went. And I was allowed to go. And one of the people that was driving was C.G. Neese, who became the federal judge at Greenville. He was Kefauver's administrative assistant. And Lucille Myers and myself and maybe someone from New Hampshire in that town that we had just been to or we were going to. And I have a photograph that I found a few weeks ago of myself in 1956 in Berlin, New Hampshire, in a room not much bigger than this, with about 30 people, and Estes Kefauver speaking, and I was standing in the back with a shirt and tie and a jacket on, and everyone else was quite relaxed, and the older men and everything. No women, as a matter of fact, in this photograph. So it was an interesting, and then in 56, he asked me to do the same thing. And at the 52 convention, he asked me to be his page at the Senate, at the convention. And so I went to the 52 convention that Kefauver was running for president, lost on the third ballot to Adlai Stevenson because Harry Truman wanted to get even with Kefauver beating him in the New Hampshire presidential primary. Kefauver won 17 of the 19 presidential primaries that year and was not nominated. He did not carry Florida and Georgia. Richard Russell did. Maybe Oklahoma with Bob Kerr. I'm not sure. But anyway, that's how.
There in the early 50s, as a participant in Senator Kefauver's campaign, what impressed you about the senator?
Oh, he cared about people.
Was that your introduction to Tennessee?
Yes. Senator Kefauver was like a father to me.
At that time, were you interested in becoming a lawyer?
No, never decided to become a lawyer until my final semester in college.
Yeah. We'll get to that.
Okay. All right.
Well, you're working with and getting to know Senator Estes Kefauver. You're a high school student.
Yeah.
How does a Brookline, Massachusetts high school student get to Tusculum here in East Tennessee?
Because Senator Kefauver suggested I go there. I also was applied at Sewanee and at Trinity in Connecticut, and I just felt Tusculum might be a better suit for me.
There may be some who are watching this interview who don't know much about Tusculum. Tell us a little bit about the college and where it's located.
College is located in Greenville, Tennessee. It's the 28th oldest college in the United States. The oldest college west of the Allegheny Mountains, south of the Ohio River. It was the first college in Tennessee to integrate both women and blacks. It is in a covenant relationship with the Presbyterian Church. Has a couple of thousand students now. When I went there, it did not. And later on we can explain why it has a couple of thousand students.
What were your activities as a Tusculum student?
Oh, I was editor of the newspaper. I ran the track team. I did a lot of things.
Did you enjoy your time at Tusculum?
Yes, I did. I thought Tusculum was good for me, and that Tusculum was small. I had professors that I had a relationship with that I respected, and I learned from. And I had classes probably with no more than 10 students after my freshman year. I went from Tusculum to Vanderbilt, from Vanderbilt to Columbia, and from Columbia to the University of Leicester in England. So it was a stepping thing, and Tusculum was a great foundation for me.
At the time you enrolled at Tusculum, were the majority of the students from Tennessee?
No. The majority of the students were from New Jersey and other places like that. New Jersey never had a real public higher education system other than Rutgers. And what you had was Seton Hall and Fairleigh Dickinson, and that was about it. And it did not have many other public institutions in that state. And so, and Tusculum had developed a relationship for some reason or other, and had alumni all over New Jersey. And so we had people from New Jersey and New York and Indiana. So we had them from around the country.
Do you recall a favorite professor at Tusculum?
Yes, I had a professor named Gene Brooks, who was Dr. Brooks, retired from the University of California at Berkeley, teaching English history and British Commonwealth studies, etc. And it was a devout Presbyterian, felt she would do some missionary work, and so she came to Tennessee and to teach at Tusculum, and taught at Tusculum for a number of years, and was a great professor. And one thing I remember someone once asking her, Dr. Brooks, how old are you? And her response was, you know, I don't mind telling you, but I just don't want to develop bad habits in you. So she was great. She taught international relations, and she was just a very good professor.
Do you maintain relationships with any of your former Tusculum classmates?
I do. It's funny. Some of my Tusculum classmates are scattered all around the country. I don't know why, but that's true. I was involved in my 50th reunion, but a few of them I keep in touch with. Not many. After all, when I graduated from Tusculum, I think my graduating class was maybe 85 people. And, you know, and you take that and you scatter that all over the country, it's hard to keep track of people.
Did you feel that Tusculum prepared you for the next step, which we're going to talk about, Vanderbilt?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Before you went to college, had you gotten to know any lawyers in the Brookline community?
No. No, I didn't.
Was Senator Kefauver a lawyer?
Oh, yes. He graduated from Yale.
And did he perhaps casually suggest that the law might be a good career for you?
He kind of talked about it. I I didn't have any, I didn't know what I wanted to do. At one point in life, I thought I was a pre-ministerial student. And then I realized the Lord could do a lot better. And then I thought I might be a coach and a history teacher. And so I had these diversions. The law never really was something I decided to do until my last semester in college.
During your years at Tusculum, did you remain active in any way in political activities?
Oh, yeah. I was active in the college. We had a college Young Democrats group, and I was involved in the National Federation, what became the College Young Democrats of America, which, while I was in law school, I was national vice chairman of.
Okay. Now it's your last year at Tusculum, and the concept of going to law school enters your thinking. How did that come about?
Oh, you know, that's I'm not terribly sure. I know that I thought about going to the Maxwell School at Syracuse, public affairs. I thought maybe I'd be a government flunky. And then I don't know why I got into the law school. I'm going to say something that no one would ever admit to, but I will. I'm perhaps the only person admitted to Vanderbilt, denied admission to the University of Tennessee, and put on the waiting list at Yale. You know, that's an interesting thing. But I was not admitted to the University of Tennessee College of Law. I was denied admission. I was admitted at Vanderbilt, and I was placed on the waiting list at Yale. Years later, I had a law review article that was subsequently published in the Syracuse Journal of International Law and Commerce. I had also submitted it to the Yale Journal of International Law. Yale took forever to, and they finally called me, and they said they wanted to publish it. And I was highly flattered, but I'd already agreed to Syracuse doing it, and Syracuse made it the lead article in that issue of the Law Review. And so, as we were concluding our conversation, and I'm thanking the people from Yale, I said, "Would you do me a favor?" And they said, "Sure." I said, "How close are you physically to the alumni, to the admissions office?" And they said, "We're on the third floor of this building, and they're on the second floor." I said, "Would you do me a favor as you were leaving today?" And they said, "What?" I said, "I've been on the waiting list at Yale for 30-some years, and I wanted you to tell them to take me off."
Did you enjoy your law school time at Vanderbilt?
Yes, I did. Vanderbilt, a great school. I found that Vanderbilt lacked one thing, which I think they had at the University of Tennessee, and that was what you did after you graduated from law school. What did you do with your law degree? What did you do with the brief that you wrote, etc.? Vanderbilt was very esoteric. I had great professors at Vanderbilt. I learned a lot, but I never learned how to practice law. I remember in 1960, when Vogel ran for re-election, his campaign manager was Frank Gray, the mayor of Franklin, who subsequently became, at Vogel's behest, the United States District Judge in Middle Tennessee at the federal court. And I used to spend Thanksgiving with the Grays in Franklin. And one Thanksgiving, we're driving down to Franklin, and he asked me what I had done that week, and I told him I had written a brief and done a motion. And he said, "What are you going to do with them?" And I said, "I really don't know." And he said, "Well, Bruce, you take the motion to the clerk." And he proceeded to tell me about things like that. Vanderbilt did not look favorably, for instance, did not want illegal services. It now, of course, is into, all that, because that's the thing. And UT did have it in those days. And I remember Herman Troutman, who taught estates and wills, gave us an assignment to write a will. And then he asked someone who had written the will what they would charge for it. And of course, that was the last thing we ever talked about was money at Vanderbilt, other than paying. And the person said $45. And Professor Troutman looked at him and said, if you want to be a missionary, there's a divinity school 120 yards away. And but we just did not talk about those sort of things. Some students clerked, but I never did.
Who was the best professor you had at Vanderbilt?
Two. Eddie Morgan. Eddie Morgan taught evidence. Eddie Morgan taught at Harvard. He started, we had those foundation books, the blue-covered books that had everything. He was the originator of that. And he taught evidence, and he was wonderful. In fact, my best grade in law school was evidence. My second favorite was Elliott Evans Cheatham. Professor Cheatham, in those days, the Ivy League got rid of you if you were 65. And so they got rid of Eddie Morgan, this great professor, author of Morgan on Evidence, which is now Weinstein and maybe someone else now. And they would get rid of him at 65. And Vanderbilt, through John Wade, the dean, was smart enough to pick him up. And so he brought Eddie Morgan, and he brought Elliott Evans Cheatham, who had been Charles Evans Hughes Professor of Law at Columbia. And he taught ethics, and he taught conflicts, and was a courtly gentleman, originally from Georgia, graduate of the University of Georgia. And my first two dogs as an adult were Morgan and Cheatham. And I always felt that was the highest compliment you could pay. I did name my youngest son, this is a funny story, my youngest son David found a dog in our lawn that had been shaved and had just been dumped. And I subsequently found out it was about 4 or 5 years old, and it was a sweet dog. And I said, yes, we could keep it for the weekend, and then we'd bring it to the shelter. Well, it never got to the shelter. And I don't know why. David had an interest in politics, and he decided we were going to call it Frank. And I said, Frank what? And he thought, we'll call it Frank Clement. And I said, okay, we'll call it Frank Goad Clement. Well, I told Miss Annabelle Clement O'Brien, the state, she thought it was lovely. I told Bob one day, we were at the Democratic Convention in New York, I think in the 90s, early 90s. And I told him about it. I don't think he ever took kindly to it. But Senator Kefauver used to send you a coupon for 25 pounds of dog food if you named a dog for him. And he also would send savings bonds when children were named after him.
Has there been a study to see how many Estes there are as a result of that?
Damn few.
Maybe we need a few more.
Yes.
As you made your course selection in law school, were you beginning to design those with the idea that there was an area of practice you wanted to pursue?
No. It's funny. I went to law school, studied in law school, never thought about what I was going to do when I was through. Everyone, has an idea they're going to do this, they're going to do that. Senator Kefauver suggested that when I graduated, I should be an assistant United States attorney. So he told, I'm not going to name the man because it's not fair, but he told this man who was the United States attorney at that time and who he had made United States Attorney. And we were together because I was Senator Kefauver's state field secretary toward the latter part of my legal career. I was his only employee in the state, and I had an office in the Estes Kefauver Federal Building. It wasn't Estes Kefauver Federal Building then, but it was just the Federal Building. And I had a corner office on the third or fourth floor. I used to have the door plate in my office, and told this man, said, you know, I want Bruce to be an assistant United States attorney, and he's going to graduate next December, and he'll take the bar in February, and he can join you all at that time. And this man said, oh, yes, no problem, Mr. Senator. Kefauver dies in August 10th, 1963. I turned 25 on August the 11th. And I'd been in Paris at that time working for NATO. Kefauver wanted me. Anyway, I came back and I went to see this United States attorney, the United States attorney, and he said no, he had no jobs open for me. And it was one of my great lessons in politics. And I became very disgusted with politics. And as a matter of fact, I did not vote in the 1964 presidential election.
During your law school time, would you work during the summers in between semesters?
What I did, I would go every afternoon to my office in the Federal Building. I did not have a car. I walked down from the law school to the Federal Building. And I had a parking spot. Everyone there were only like 12 in the back of the Federal Building. U.S. District Judge, United States Attorney, United States Senator, Member of Congress, etc. And there's a spot there vacant every day, all year long, and everyone's drooling for this spot. And I remember when John Black, who worked in the Department of Labor, came to me one day. He said, "Are we friends, Bruce?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Can I use your parking space?" And I said, "My friends never talk to me about my parking space." But I would come down from law school, and I would study or do what I needed to do. I had certain things Kefauver wanted me to do. And then around 5 o'clock, 5:30, I would then depart and come back on campus, and I lived on campus. And then later I lived in an apartment. But anyway, my first year in law school, I was a part-time reporter for the Tennessean. And I did obituaries and what have you, along with other stories. I would even be sent out sometimes to meet with older people and interview them, saying, we're trying to gain some history of the community and what your involvement and what have you. And I'd sit there and I'd take it down, and then it would come back and be filed away in the obituary file for when they died. It was an interesting experience. But I did that for about a year. And then I wrote some other things.
As a Tennessean reporter, who was the most notable person you interviewed?
Oh, Rogers Caldwell, the Caldwells. Who broke the Tennessee gravy train? The Bank of Tennessee. We have a Bank of Tennessee here in Kingsport that's headquartered here. And Bill Green from Greenville, from president of the Carter County Bank, and Kingsport native, a friend of Betsy's. When he named it the Bank of Tennessee, I said, "Bill, you don't have a good sense of Tennessee history, because the Bank of Tennessee caused the Depression in this state." And then on a number of occasions, I was invited down to have lunch with Meredith Caldwell at his home in Franklin, and Judge Gray would bring me.
Who were some of your law school buddies, and where are they now?
I have one, most of my law school buddies are scattered around. A number of them, unfortunately, are no longer with us. I have lunch every Friday with Gorman Wardell. And Gorman is an estates lawyer, what have you. And we have at lunch with another person every Friday at the Meadowview Hotel. I have no other classmates in this area.
Looking back on your time at Vanderbilt, if you were looking back, would you have changed your course selection or your activities in any way?
No. The one thing I think I gained from Vanderbilt, being a lawyer is not a trade school. And there's nothing wrong with a trade school, but a law school is not a trade school. And I found I took courses that interested me, that I thought would make me a brighter person. I did not, I wasn't like some people who knew they were going to go home and be a real estate lawyer with their father. I hated real estate. I've never done a deed or anything like that in my life. The reason being, when in my spring break, my second year in law school, I was going to go scuba diving. Instead, our real estate lawyer had us go down and trace a title for a piece of property in downtown Nashville, and took the whole damn vacation. And I vowed if that was the practice of law, I wanted nothing whatsoever to do with it. And so I have never done a title work or a deed or anything like that. That's for other folks.
Before your Vanderbilt graduation, had you decided you wanted to get a Master of Laws at another school?
No. Well, yes and no. I went to Columbia from Vanderbilt because of Elliott Evans Cheatham, my advisor, who had been Charles Evans Hughes Professor of Law at Columbia, and for whom the Student Lounge was named. He urged me to go to Columbia, to graduate school, and picked up the phone and did everything necessary to see that it happened.
And the Columbia you're referring to is Columbia University in New York City.
Yes.
Did you spend did you go straight to Columbia, or did you spend any interim
time? Let me think. I went straight to New York after finishing Vanderbilt. I had a job in New York in the legal department of broadcast music, BMI. And I was there for maybe 2 years while I was going to graduate law school, studying copyright and entertainment law. And I became assistant to the president of BMI. I had had an office that was just a cubbyhole at that thing. But I was never a part of the New York crowd. And my boss, the president of BMI, was Judge Robert Burton. And Judge Burton, unfortunately, had a drinking problem and burned himself up in a hotel fire in British Columbia. God save the Queen. The Queen's dead. God save the King. It was that situation. I was moved out of my tiny little office as the assistant to the president to a much bigger office with no work. And I asked them after a couple of months, would they pay me if I left? And they said yes. And so they did, and I did all kinds of crazy things. I was a model. I did a whole catalog of socks. That sort of thing.
You were a sock model?
Yeah, I was a model, yeah. I made money as a model in New York. I looked much better than I do today. I did that, and then I had a job offer to go to Washington to be one of the two legislative assistants to Ross Bass, who was then the United States Senator from Tennessee, who had succeeded Hub Walters. Interestingly enough, I succeeded Hub Walters as Democratic National Committeeman the next time the thing came up, and I was rather young. But anyway, I worked for Bass, and then Bass lost to Frank Clement in the primary, and then in the general election, Clement lost to Howard Baker. Bass had beaten Howard Baker 2 years earlier. And so Bass is out, and he loans me to Hubert Humphrey. And so I moved from being paid on the staff of Ross Bass between then and the election, and then afterwards I'm on the payroll of Hubert Humphrey.
During this time, are you still a Columbia student?
No, I know. I finished Columbia.
Okay.
I never got a degree from Columbia, Howard. That, I think, is important. I never, I took courses that I wanted to take, not toward a degree. It wasn't until much later in life that I earned my LLM, which is an interesting story in and of itself.
And we'll come to that in a
At a
few
later
moments.
point.
Who were some of your Columbia law school buddies?
I really can't. I remember a couple, but remember, they were regular Columbia students, and I was a special student that came in to various classes. So I didn't really, and then I was working too, so I didn't have a relationship with, at that point in time, yeah, I probably had some friends, but I'd be damned if I can remember who they were. I remember one named Eastman because his father was a very prominent entertainment lawyer.
During that time at Columbia, did you become involved in New York political activities?
Only one endeavor. I had a friend of mine, I lived in the Village, and a friend of mine was very strong for John Lindsay. And I personally felt that the Democratic Party in New York City was rather corrupt, and I didn't really want to have anything to do with politics. And he asked me if I would help in some stuff for John Lindsay, so I did. And I was a great admirer of John Lindsay, and frankly, probably had I remained in New York, I would have become a Manhattan Republican.
Well, history took a big shift there.
Yeah, but remember, in those days, the Republican Party in New York was Nelson Rockefeller and John Lindsay and Jacob Javits and Kenneth Keating. They would know the Republican Party of today.
Why don't we take a short break, and when we return, I want to ask you about the next step in your legal education, which is quite fascinating.
Okay.
Bruce, did you take the New York bar before going to further your studies abroad?
I took the New York bar before, after Columbia, immediately after. I'll be honest, I failed the New York bar the first time. I went up to Albany to see my paper and found that I had done exceedingly well in the essay portion, but had done poorly on how many days do you have to file a motion for such and such. And I had taken the Practicing Law Institute Bar Review course in New York. And I had a number of my professors there who were Columbia people. One of two I had classes under. But anyway, it was very esoteric. And I had notebooks this high, this high, that PLI would give me. And of course they charged a fortune for the course. and I failed it. And I failed all the little nitty-gritty stuff. And of course, those days we did not have a uniform bar exam. And so, having gone up there and looked at it, I then decided I would do something different. And so I went, I heard from some folks that if you really wanted to pass the New York bar, you needed to take Marino's bar review course. And so instead of 3 feet of books, this is what Marino taught from. And this is all of the substantive legal education on all these different areas of the law, starting with administrative law through uniform commercial sales. 170 some pages of this little paperback. And that's all you had to study, he told you, if you wanted to pass the bar. And by God, he was right. Then the other thing that you needed was this, the New York practice under the CPLR, which is its code of procedure. And that's where all the yeas and nays, yes and no's came from, and how many days and what have you, and the sections of the code. And so I have these. I even have Marino's obituary from the New York Times. I didn't realize it, but it's here. He died on September 9th, 2000. And he had this course that was highly successful, and it met in a hotel in New York on 6th Avenue that was basically used for Hasidic Jewish social events. And we had this ballroom that we took the course in, and upstairs was another ballroom. It was divided in half for the males and the females, as would be the case in the Hasidic Jews. And the buses would come from Brooklyn, bringing them in, and we would be studying under Marino, lecturing, telling us what to do, what we ought to know, listening to all this dancing and what have you, upstairs.
Do you recall what Mr. Marino charged for his course?
I don't. And I don't remember what the New York PLI charged me either. But I know the PLI was more expensive than Marino.
So what attracted your interest to going to
let me say this.
Okay.
I was sworn in to the bar in New York on the day that I left for Washington. I took the train to Washington in the afternoon after being sworn in the Second Judicial Department in New York.
Do you still maintain your New York license?
No. What happened, strangely, New York decided, like Tennessee, you now are going to pay a couple $100 a year for it. And I didn't know it. No one ever told me. And I stupidly did not ever give the New York bar my mailing address when I moved. And so I have my license. It's up there hanging on the wall. And if you ask them, they'll say I never registered. And then I have a license, of course, in the District of Columbia.
So you get to D.C. and
yes.
What are you doing there, and when did you decide more education was important?
There is a gap of 30 years between one bit of education and another. So let's talk about Washington.
Good.
I go to Washington and I work for Clarence K. Strite, who was the founder, wrote the book Union Now, and in the 40s and 50s was very, very prominent in America in terms of the Atlantic Alliance and things of that nature. He had been a New York Times correspondent, wrote Union Now at the beginning of World War II, basically urging that the democracies of Western Europe band together in a union that included common citizenship and postal defense, and those other areas.
I understand that Senator Kefauver was interested in
Yes.
Mr. Strite and his
Yes.
opinions.
Remember, at this point in time, Kefauver was dead. He had been dead for 2 years, 3 years. And Clarence Strite needed someone to help him because he was a genius and he was an amazing guy, but he had a way of alienating people that worked for him. And I arranged a conference for him for Lester Pearson, who was the Prime Minister of Canada, and in Springfield, outside Springfield, in Lincoln's, in the reconstruction of the village that time existed. And Lester Pearson came, and I had been an advance man, done some work for John Kennedy, and because of that, I was able to really put something on. Went to Springfield, Illinois. We had the congressman, Paul Finley, who was very much for us, like Kefauver had been. Paul Finley is still alive, probably in his 90s. And we decided we needed a crowd. And we didn't have any members, you know, it was known then as Federal Union. And so I arranged for all these very lovely invitations because we had all kinds. We had the former British ambassador to Russia as one of our speakers. We had the Prime Minister of Canada. We had the congressman for the district, but we didn't have anyone local. And so we had this luncheon for the former ambassador to Russia. And so I arranged these fancy invitations that so-and-so requesting the pleasure, you know. And so we sent out all these invitations to lawyers, doctors, and CPAs. And lo and behold, we got like 150 people for the luncheon. And we even had more for the banquet. And we did bring about, 150 of our own people in for conferences.
What year was this, Bruce?
Let's think. It must have been 67, 66, 67, something like that. And I wrote some articles later for, I think one of Freedom. We published a magazine every month called Freedom and Union. And I think I had an article about it in it, or they had an article about what I did. But anyway, Lester Pearson we brought him in, and I had Canadian flags. They had just put in the new Canadian flag at that time, the maple leaf. So I had the downtown flags all the way up, on the poles, and I spent money like that. And got some help from the consulate of Canada in Chicago. And we really laid it out. Lester Pearson was a great supporter of Clarence Strite, a good friend of his. And so we had Pearson fly in his private jet from his prime minister. And when it was all over, I have a great photograph of myself with Lester Pearson. I did another trip for him in the United States as a result of this one. And he said, Bruce, he said, at home in Ottawa, I often drive myself home at night. And we had motorcycle escorts everywhere he went. And, and the governor of Illinois was, I forget who it was, but he just laid out the curtain for us, too. And so it was quite a show.
At this time, were you were actually working in D.C.?
Yes.
And who was your employer at that time?
Clarence K. Strite.
Were you working as an administrative person or a lawyer?
Oh, as an administrative person.
Would you tell us a little bit more about Clarence Strite's philosophy regarding the union of democracies?
He felt, in 1939, he sat down and wrote a book. and self-published it, called Union Now. And in it he felt that if the democracies outside the Nazi sphere at that time would gather together and form a union, common citizenship, postal service, each one would have their own military, but they would retain their sovereignty. Sovereignty is a great issue. I could do a half an hour dissertation on sovereignty, what it is and where it comes from. And Streit felt that way we could combat Nazism. Then he wrote another book called Union Now with Britain, because at that point, you had the South Africa, you had Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all part of the British Commonwealth, and that's what we ought to do. Well, we never did any of that. The closest we got was NATO. We had an Atlantic Conference at one point that talked about it, but never did anything about it. But Streit spent his entire life advocating this union of the Atlantic democracies and the democracies of Western Europe and North America.
Is the current European Union something similar to what Clarence Streit envisioned?
Yes. And it's half. Jean Monnet, who is the father of the European Union, was a wine salesman in the 30s, and somehow or another, he dreamed this idea of a European Union. He knew many of the people that Streit knew. Schuman, the foreign minister of France, Paul-Henri Spaak, the prime minister and everything else of Belgium, and all these other people. And both of them were working toward the same end, except Monnet wanted it to stop at the French line, okay? And Streit wanted to go more. And that was their difference. And Streit's in the United States, and the United States is, somewhat isolationist and not all that keen about international affairs. And so the European Union comes out of the European Coal and Steel Community Treaty, which Schuman and Konrad Adenauer are responsible for. Because it was felt that if we were going to make sure Europe was safe and peaceful, we needed the two potential protagonists, France and Germany, to be locked together. And both of them had coal and steel, and they both needed it. One was making steel, and you need coal to make steel, and what have you. And so that was Monnet's idea how we get started. And he got started that way. And then we had the Euratom Treaty shortly thereafter, which led to the Treaty of Rome of 1957, which is the beginning of the European Union, with 5 states joining together. Germany, France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Holland.
I want to come back to the Streit Council a little
Sure.
bit later today, because I know you remain involved.
Oh, yes.
But let's go back to D.C. How much time did you spend in D.C. before you came to Tennessee to practice law?
3 years.
And was all of that time in assisting the Streit Council?
No. First it was Ross Bass. First it was Streit Council, then it was Ross Bass, then it was Hubert Humphrey. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story about how I decided to come to Tennessee. I had a job offer with the firm headed by, in this part of it, John Mcclellan, Kingsport, but the firm was headed by Herb Thatcher in Washington. We had offices on K Street. But I had met a man named Count Caracciolo in Europe when I was at NATO. And when I was working for Bass, and Bass was going out of office, and Caracciolo offered me a job to be the High Commissioner the OECD pavilion at the World's Fair in Montreal. Now, OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the major economic entity in Europe. Count Caracciolo, I had met when I was in Paris, but I'll get back to that in a second. But Caracciolo offered me this job.
Is this roughly 67,
67.
67.
And I seriously considered it. But it was only for 3 years, and I was to take this building, which was collapsible, and bring it to some parts of the United States and sell on the concept of the OECD, then take it to Japan for the World's Fair in Japan. And, you know, to be 26, 27 years old and to be the High Commissioner at a World's Fair for a foreign entity was, you know, quite a deal. But I thought to myself, what am I going to say when it's over? That I was a tour guide for a building, and there was no guarantee that I was going to get hired by OECD and go back. OECD is based in Paris, and work there. And so I decided I didn't need to be a tour guide for a building. And so I took the law job in Tennessee. That's how I got to Tennessee. But Caracciolo, I first met when I was working at NATO, and they had the president of Italy coming to visit. And my boss knew that I had done some advance work for John Kennedy. Particularly Kennedy, I was one of the advanced people, and there's a whole chapter of my activities in a book. When Kennedy came to Nashville, to Vanderbilt, to celebrate the anniversary of Vanderbilt and to press the button to start the Percy Priest Dam. But anyway, so I met Caracciolo there in Paris, and he said to me, and I'm all of 24, 25, he said, "Do you have a foreign decoration?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, we'll get you one." And so I do all this work for this advance, and we're at the Italian embassy, and the president of Italy is saying goodbye to everyone, and they're thanking everyone. And Caracciolo says to me, "Oh my God, I forgot your decoration." He said, "I don't know what we have left." And so he goes back in. I guess they carry a box of decorations, you know, they give to foreign ministers and what have you. And so I had the Order of the Star of Solidarity of the Republic of Italy. Beautiful gold thing that goes around my neck, and a rosette and a miniature and what have you. And he said to me, "You know," he said, "you're not worthy of this." He said, "But I did promise you one."
Do you continue to wear that decoration on formal occasions?
Not really. I wore it. The greatest wear it's ever had is playing Count Dracula at Halloween with my children growing up. But I do wear the miniature, and I wear the rosette quite often, and I wear the miniature along with a group of other medals that I have that are put together on a back thing so that I can just put it on.
The how does a young man, so well educated, world traveler, interested in the major issues of European and American democracy, decide to come to Tennessee to practice law?
I was to be in the Washington office. My name was on the door. And it was the remnants of the Kingsport strike and what have you. And Mcclellan was here, and I was told to come here. And I came here, and that's where I got stuck.
Of course, you were a college student in Tennessee, so you had some familiarity with the state.
I knew the area. When I was editor of the Pioneer, the newspaper at Tusculum, we used to have it published in a building right next door to where we are today. So I would come up and the one thing we used to find so interesting about Kingsport is that it had a Chinese restaurant. Greenville didn't, and it was. We'd come up to work on the paper to put it together, and go to the Chinese restaurant.
Did you take the Tennessee bar exam?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Anything?
I'll tell you a funny thing about the Tennessee bar. I never took a bar cram course. I had a friend of mine who had taken the one that is not Donald Payne, but it was someone else in Nashville. Had and I borrowed his books, and I studied for a week, and I passed the Tennessee bar. But it was different then. It really was different. And we were, the education at Vanderbilt was somewhat esoteric. And when you get into a bar exam and you start asking questions, you need someone who knows something and someone who can explain it rather than how many days do you have to file an appeal. That's what books are for.
What was it like being a young lawyer here in East Tennessee in your early days?
Oh, it was very different. Because John Mcclellan had a national law practice, and this firm had a national law practice, he was general counsel to the International Printing Pressmen Assistants Union of North America. It was not unusual for me to be gone 2 or 3 days a week somewhere in the United States doing a case before the National Labor Relations Board.
Was most of your practice as a young lawyer away from the state, but for the interests of the firm?
Well, we could say half and half. For instance, I did a few divorces in my life, and the last divorce I did was 35, 40 years ago, when an agency I represented had an employee who wanted to catch up on, got married after being a widow for 30 years or so, and thought she'd catch up on her conjugal relationship at age 65 or 55. And she married this man who was 65, and he brought his own refrigerator to the marriage, which should have told her something. And she started calling me every Monday, telling me what a horrible weekend they had and how awful it was. Well, I told her I didn't marry the SOB, she did, and that I'd get her divorce and not to call me again. And I did get her divorce. That was the last divorce I've done other than helping a partner of mine in a divorce case where involving a doctor and a deputy sheriff, and the doctor was a female. And we spent 2 days trying to show that there were no grounds for a divorce. And Judge Ladd agreed. And the doctor about had heart failure. And she had filed the action. And therefore, and the whole thing was all about money. And he got enough money to call it quits and agree to the divorce. But I haven't done anything like that. I've never done a deed, okay? I've never done a property dispute. I've done a child custody, but that was a very unusual situation. But my practice, it could take like this. I could study.
Tell us a little bit more about the Mcclellan Firm when you arrived. How many lawyers? Tell us a little bit about.
We had about 3 lawyers in Washington, and we had 2 in Kingsport, Shelburne Ferguson Jr. and myself and Mcclellan. That's the way it was. We stayed with Mcclellan for about 3 years, and then Shelburne and I went out on our own. And John Mcclellan had personal issues, and we'll leave it at that.
The lawyers in D.C., were they Tennessee lawyers also?
No. One of them was Neil Rutledge, the son of Wiley Rutledge, the Supreme Court Justice. Herb Thatcher was another one. Herb Thatcher was general counsel to the aluminum workers, the postal clerks, special counsel to the Teamsters. He was an amazing lawyer and a premier labor lawyer in America.
What was it like practicing with Mr. McClellan?
McClellan, let me preface it by saying the record seems to sustain the fact that he never went to law school and never took the Tennessee bar and had practiced for over 30-some years without benefit of a license. He was a genius. He would, when we would, and he wrote briefs, Burkett McIntyre, a criminal lawyer in this town, once said that John McClellan could write you out of jail. He would stand and start a brief on a labor law matter and look at me and say, Bruce, look for printing press men such and such against so-and-so. It's about 127 Fed second, somewhere in the 200 to 300 range. And I would go look and I'd find it. And then he would say, let me have it. And then he'd quote what he wanted in that part of the brief, and he'd give me, so that his mind was working on cases and for his briefs ahead of his ever dictating them, saying, so he knew I want to do this one and this one later on in this brief. He was very bright. He taught me a number of things. Eternally grateful for him as a mentor. He taught me, for instance, I never write a complaint without doing a 3 or 4 first paragraph explaining what the lawsuit's all about. And the reason McClellan felt that was important was that in those days you often read the complaint to the jury when you started the case, and then someone else read the answer. And so, you didn't need all this stuff until about 5 minutes into the complaint what it was all about. And so he said, tell them right it is, right up front. Let them know. This is an action by a local for a breach of the collective bargaining agreement with the newspaper, and that's it. That's what the case was all about. Then do 1 plaintiff, 2 defendant, 3 jurisdiction.
Do you remember what your starting salary or compensation plan was when you joined the Mcclellan Firm?
There was never anything called a compensation plan in those days. I was making $15,000, $16,000, which was a lot of money then, in Washington. And I made maybe $6,000 a year with McClellan. It was not highly lucrative, but then again, young lawyers didn't get paid much then. They took jobs for $500, $600, $700 a week, and were thankful for it.
What was the life of a young lawyer at that time? How did you spend your time? How many days a week did you work? How many hours a day?
Oh, I worked every day. I had a social life, and I was involved in various things. I got, you get to a town, and for instance, I was appointed to the Tennessee Arts Commission in 1967, 40 days after I came to Kingsport. I was appointed by Governor Ellington. And so everyone wondered, who the hell is Bruce Shine, who had just been appointed to the Tennessee Arts Commission? And so all of a sudden, all the arts folks wanted to know me because of the fact that the Tennessee Arts Commission was going to give money out.
Did the Vice President of the United States play a role in that?
Yeah, I'll tell you, that's a funny one. When I got ready to leave, before I got ready to leave Washington, I told the Vice President, he asked me if he could do anything for me. And I said, yeah, I'd like to be appointed to the Tennessee Arts Commission. They've just created it. And he said, okay. He picked up the phone. He called Buford Ellington, and Ellington, of course, and Lyndon Johnson were great buddies. And Hubert Humphrey said to Ellington, I'd like you to appoint, I understand you're creating a Tennessee Arts Commission, and I have a young man that's coming back to Tennessee, and he'd like to be on the commission. Do you have any obligations in terms of a seat for him on this new body? And Ellington was, and he said, Lyndon and I would really appreciate it. And then, Lyndon sends his best, Buford.
And
of course, Lyndon Johnson knew nothing about it. And I became, and through that I got to know Dick Barry. And under the initial situation with the Arts Commission, you only could serve, one term of 3 years. Well, I was appointed for a term of 2 years. And so I ultimately served 5 years. I was introduced not long ago as the youngest person ever appointed to the Tennessee Arts Commission, and also as the youngest person ever to be chairman, and its oldest living former chairman.
Bruce, the young lawyers, what was collegiality at the bar here in Kingsport when you came to town to practice law?
Well, we knew everyone. There weren't that many of us. The bar was maybe 65, 75 people. And we knew everyone. There was a sense of collegiality. And we knew who the SOBs were and who the nice guys were and and we had in those days, lawyers would, particularly the solo practitioners, they would send cases to young lawyers if it was outside what they did, to nurture them. And they didn't mind answering. I remember in Johnson City, I'll think of it. Anyway, distinguished lawyer over there. And you could pick up the phone and ask him a federal procedure. And he knew it backwards and forwards. There was that sense, okay? We had the sounding of dockets in those days if you had local matters. And so you saw everyone at the sounding of the docket. And you talked. We had a bar association that met here in Kingsport. We have always had a bar association in Kingsport. The other Tri-Cities have had them, but not with the same degree of regularity as us. It was just, it was a pleasant experience practicing law, as long as you evaded the SOBs.
When you arrived in Kingsport and for the next 5 or 6 years to follow, was this pretty much a company town?
Yes, it was very much a Tennessee Eastman town. And Tennessee Eastman, there's a gentleman who will go unnamed, an executive at Eastman, and he decided what the hell was going to happen a lot of times. I must, in all honesty, say that my father-in-law was president of Eastman Chemical Products and 4 other subsidiaries of Kodak, because at that point in time, Eastman was a Kodak subsidiary.
Would this be an appropriate time to talk about Betsy?
Sure, why not?
What is your wife's name?
My wife's name is Elizabeth McGoffin Shine. Yes, she's the same age as I am until the 11th of August next month.
How did you meet?
We met, oddly enough, a friend of mine who went to Tusculum, lived in Kingsport, and his wife introduced me to Betsy. And I took Betsy to, we had a May Day bar dinners in those days. And I took Betsy to hear Frank Wilson, who was a wonderful human being, who was the district judge in Chattanooga. And he came up, and as many people didn't realize, he would oftentimes, during his vacations, visit people in prisons where he had incarcerated them. And Betsy came, and he was a rather dull speaker, I might add, but very dry and what have you. He had a brother, Bill Wilson, who practiced law in Knoxville. But anyway, Frank Wilson had practiced out of Oak Ridge, and Senator Kefauver had gotten him his appointment under Kennedy. Well, Betsy was so grand at that listening to it and putting up with it, I figured, God, this woman's okay. To come to a bar association banquet, is a bit much, and tolerant. And so we ended up that night going to the Civic Auditorium, where they had almost a quasi-teenage rock dance thing going on. And that's how I got to meet Betsy.
Now, at this point, how many years as a Tennessee lawyer are we counting?
Well, I got married, let me see what year. I got married in 71, so we're talking about 6 or 7 years, 30, 31.
So you were well established at that time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you apparently liked Tennessee.
Oh yeah, and I kept an apartment with another person in Washington until I married Betsy, and I had a blue aluminum key to the doors off DuPont Circle. And Betsy once asked me when I was going to get rid of my blue key, and so I ultimately did.
Do you all have children?
Yes, we have 3 children.
Tell me about them.
James Vincent is my oldest, and he was interested in the arts and was a sculptor. He was he went to Columbus College of Art and Design, got his BFA there, then went to the University of Chicago and earned an MFA, and became very successful in Chicago. Had a gallery that represented him. And in fact, Art in America did a spread of his work when he was like 28. And he had open shows in Europe. He had shows in at least 2 shows in England, Rome, and Salzburg. Betsy and I would go to the openings, and had a gallery in Chicago that went bankrupt, owing him $35,000, which meant they had sold $70,000 worth of his work. And Vincent decided this was not what he was going to do in life, have this situation. So instead, he went back to kind of graduate school, University of Illinois, and became a designer of products. For instance, if this were a medical device, Vincent would tell you how it should be designed so that you can use it. He'd work with doctors on that. And that led into his doing apps. And he's a real expert on apps. Now, I don't know much about it, but at one point he worked for Arthur Andersen. He had about 80 people under him, and he's in his late 20s, early 30s. And he was spending time in China for Arthur Andersen. They go belly up. He goes with another firm. It goes belly up. He is hired by Samsung, works for, but he's living in Chicago, and he's got a wife and 2 children. And he has an apartment in Dallas, and he's spending really a week every month or every other month in Seoul. And also in China and Brazil, because he's good at the apps. And I didn't know it, but these countries want different things on their apps. And he is now with a British firm in Chicago. And he is a consultant, and he takes on clients and tells them how to do their things. And he's been very successful at it. my next son, he's married. Vincent has 2 girls. My next son, Edward Mcclellan, named after his grandfather, he went to Tusculum, decided that he wanted to go into the Navy, and did. Went to Newport, school there, carried the sword and all that at the graduation. Edward stayed in the Navy for 22 years, retired the next day, went back to work doing the same thing he had done before. And so I think it's unusual, poor old man like me still working, coming to work every day, and Edward's drawing a paycheck and a retirement check. I've got the Social Security, but still. So Edward Wood stayed with the Navy, but he and his wife Annette, she was pregnant. They had one small child. They had lost a child, and Edward felt he needed to be home with Annette, and he asked the Navy if they would give him more time to go. And they said no, they needed someone then. And I asked Edward, I said, well, why would the Navy need a supply officer in the Green Belt in Iraq, given all the people in the Army? And he said, because they don't have anyone left, supply officers. The Army is kind of low on them, so they borrow them from the Navy. And then I asked him, I said, well, what do you know about this assignment? I said, do you know anyone that's ever had it? And he said, yes, I do. And he said, I knew 2 people. And I said, well, what did they tell you? He said, they're both dead. And so with that kind of background setting, with his wife about 7 months pregnant, this child, having lost a child a year before, they made a decision to retire. And the Navy then made a decision they wanted him because Edward has a master's degree in international economics. And he has an MBA, he has an MA in international economics from the Naval Institute at Monterey. He has an MBA from William and Mary. He spent a lot of his time in Europe, in Africa, in the bottom part of the Middle East, where the United Arab States are. We're building a Navy place at Djibouti. He spends time there, and he goes back and forth quite often. So he has 2 boys, and then
But before you talk about David, did Edward retire from the Navy as a commander?
Yes, an officer and a gentleman by an act of Congress. And David is a school teacher in Richmond, Virginia, and he does other things and lives his life with his books and his interest in history.
As the boys were growing up,
Yes.
Did you offer any encouragement to them to study the law and become a lawyer?
No. I felt for some years we have too many lawyers, number one. I didn't think David is the only one. He took the LSAT. He was not suited for the law. Maybe, what's the name of the legal research group in Charlottesville? He might have worked well there, okay, where he was, but he's in...
Mickey is there.
Yeah, Mickey is there, but I'm thinking of these services you hire to write your briefs. But anyway, be that as it may, it just wasn't for him, and it wouldn't have been for him. And so with that, I never pushed it because I knew it wasn't right for him, and that we have so darn many lawyers right now in this country, and the young people are finishing law school. highly in debt, with no expectation of ever making the type of money necessary to repay that debt.
You mentioned your grandchildren. What are their names? And tell us a little about them.
All right. I have one grandson named Colin. He's about 9. And then I have another, Edward's son. Then another son of Edward's is Dylan. And Dylan is about 6. And he too is a redhead. They both are into soccer immensely, to the point that they follow the Premier Leagues in England. And they're both very good at what they do. Their father is a natural athlete. Edward has been in the Golf Channel finals as high as 11 a few years back. He has won a number of tournaments around the country with all kinds of points. He is a nautical person. He races from Annapolis to the Bahamas and things like that, and was a soccer player in college, played tennis in college. Edward is an all-around athlete, and about as firm an individual as God has made. Like that. Vincent is a charming child, and a very attentive child as he's gotten older toward his parents, which is what surprised me immensely. I never would have thought that, but he is constantly making contact to make sure I'm okay, Betsy's okay. Very, very responsive.
Tell us about Vincent's children.
He has 2. And one is Olivia. She is going to be the great actress of the American theater. She has graduated from high school in Chicago, and she's going to school, I forget where in Chicago. But anyway, be that as it may. Then she has a sister called Cleo. Cleo Elizabeth, and Elizabeth being named for Betsy. And Cleo Elizabeth is also enamored with the theater, and she's in her junior year of high school, and she's interested not in being an actress, but being behind the scenes. She played in a girls' rock band and went to summer camp in Wisconsin for girls' rock. It's a bizarre sort of situation. She's very, very much herself.
Bruce, I think we're probably at an appropriate point to take a break
Yes.
for just a little while, so we'll resume shortly.
Okay, thank you.